on Twitter and all this stuff. And I never got a response back from the lawyer, but all of a sudden I was on their mailing list. And I still remember the first thing I got from them was this thing about this UAP disclosure bill and the protections that it might give whistleblowers. And it was this seminar that they had held, but it was like retroactive. Like it had happened like a week before, and they sent it to me. And I'm like, this is weird. I've only gotten a couple emails from them ever, and that was one of them. So I didn't really press the issue, but I do leave that in my back pocket as something where, like, I know that they're probably, if this is all real, the intelligence communities are watching this interview right now. I'm just gonna go ahead and say, like, at any point I want, I can go find Edward C. Lynn, knock on his door, and be like, hey man, did you leak those videos, right? He can lie or he can tell the truth. If he really did, though, this guy is a real hero. Like, this is the kind of thing where you're showing the world, I would argue it's a crime, that what we did with that plane potentially, but not just that, like, it's,
Clearly it was a crime. There were
yeah.
passengers on that plane.
What's kind of hard though is like,
It's like mass murder in order to preserve or to interrupt some technology and send a message to China plausibly. I mean, that's one narrative that
but let's be honest, like,
it's mass murder.
nobody's going to face there's no way anyone faces any consequences for this.
No, absolutely
chance.
not.
Like,
No.
Obama knows what happened to this plane, 100%. And the reason why I know that is because I've also been listening to a lot of what these CIA agent, like not quite whistleblowers, but people that I think are being forthcoming with information talk about. And he might not have ran the operation, but after the event, like the director of national intelligence would have written up like a briefing about it that would have gone to the president, and then the president's the one that issues the policy, like how are we going to respond to this? And he actually went to Malaysia a month later. Barack Obama did. It was the first time a president has gone to Malaysia in like 50 years, and ended up talking with Najib, who was the prime minister at that time. I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but Najib is like one of the biggest criminals on the face of the earth. He got caught in the 1MDB major kleptocracy scandal, biggest one ever. $700 million of money was in a bank account in his name. He's the one that said the plane went into the South Indian Ocean. There's a picture of Barack Obama shaking his hand. The prime minister before and after him, Mahathir, he was actually prime minister when I was living in Singapore, beloved by Malaysian people. He says that the CIA knows what happened to the plane.
Of course, yeah.
And I'm just going, okay, guys, like, how much more evidence do we need that there's something sketchy going on here? So, Edward C. Lynn is the second way that these videos can just be proven authentic. If he ever comes out at any point in the future, everybody needs to rally around this guy more than any of these other whistleblowers in this UFO community, because he's showing us technology that will change our entire planet, just like that. And then the third way, again, is the science, which is my favorite part, but also, again, the part where I want people to be generous with me here. Like, I'm only 9 months into this, but I'm going to list off a bunch of people, scientists and concepts here that we're going to talk about. People say, I don't really think I have any special powers or anything that's like this, but people say, like, you have a very strong intuition. And the way that I explain the science to people, I like to explain it in a way where anyone can understand it. Because to your point, they kind of want people thinking like, no, you're like a lowly commoner, you can't understand this science, but that's not true. Like,
You can't.
anybody can really understand it. And once you have a good concept of how it operates and how we've been misled with physics in general, it starts to become apparent, how easy it was for them to lie to us about this stuff. And you start to see the brainwashing that's been stuck in there. And like, so I would make some pretty bold claims, which I would say that all the textbooks in the United States are wrong.
They're lying intentionally.
They're misleading us, and they want you to think a certain thing. It is kind of like COVID, where they implant this message into you, and you just repeat the message, like brainwashing. And that's one of the things I hear a lot related to the physics that I'm about to present as well.
History, physics, everything is intentionally, it's meant to
Especially
propagandaize
history
us.
too, not to go on a tangent, but I'm one of those people too that I usually think that there's three sides to every story: your side, my side, and the truth, or what have you, right? It's always somewhere in the middle out there. And people always look back at history, even scientists, other historical events, and you bring up, well, I don't think it really happened exactly that way, and then everybody jumps down your throat because the authority told me that that's how it must have happened. And if there's anything that people take out of this, these videos end up being proven real. I want people to realize how easy it is for them to brainwash us, so that we never let it happen again in the future. They're doing it to us all the time. It's not just Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. I personally believe, whatever your political opinions are, that they did it to us with COVID as well. And they've done it to us with many other events.
There are always mass psychosis events, and they've been doing this, and it really picked up in the 60s, where they realized that they could make everybody pay attention to something and then modify human behavior based off of an event and how people would react to that event. And that's why you guys who watch this know that I say you must read Chaos and learn about MK Ultra and the Charles Manson thing that didn't really maybe happen at all, and it was just a federal event to modify our behavior against to end the hippie generation because they wanted to go to war. And once you comprehend, and just like that, who was the guy who wrote that book? A reporter that was supposed to write 5,000 pages that became so obsessed with this case when he realized that he was being lied to, went through FOIA requests, 25 years later, went flat broke trying to get to the bottom of what happened with the Manson murders. And in the process, he gave us uh, just a tome of evidence that shows us that our government has been intentionally manipulating us and lying to us about the big stuff, because our brain goes, there's no way that this could be a lie, because you realize how big of a lie would have to be. Yeah, they've realized that we don't our brains go, no, 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 there's just no way, because they could never lie this big. And it's actually easier to tell a big lie than it is to tell a small lie.
Absolutely.
And so this is one of these things that I'm so grateful that you're obsessed with, because I'm at the point where I want to pull my kids out of school, because I realize the purpose is to
Absolutely.
make them dumber and slower and convince that they're smart. And what I do want you to get to, because this is let's get to the dark stuff, as in,
Yeah.
what are the implications here? Like, if you are correct, and I think you are, just by the way that you're being treated.
Mhm.
That always tells me the first thing. Like, if as soon as they're going to dismiss this person, I'm like, okay, that's the one I want to listen to. And I can see how obsessed you are. I also see that you're very smart and how dedicated you are into learning this. What are the implications here regarding energy?
Yeah. And just real quick, the FOIA thing that you said as well, I learned a lot about FOIAs. They reject FOIAs for anything they want. I FOIA'd the airplane regarding it to to NSA, gave me the same Obama air exemption to be kept secret in the interest of national defense under this subsection that includes covert operations. So I also FOIA'd a fire suppression bottle that showed up in the Maldives that had to have been empty because it floated, and it looks exactly like a fire suppression bottle from a Boeing 777. And I didn't even mention MH370 on that FOIA request. I said, NSA, give me whatever you've got on a random fire suppression bottle. Also rejected for the exact same exemption as well, which to me is like, guys, how many rejections do you have to get till you realize there's something going on here?
Hmm.
And what does this all lead to? There was a day where I realized this is all about free energy. And I went, wow, if you connect and follow the dots with the science, if you ask yourself, where's the energy from these self-sustaining coherent orbs coming from, you realize that all of it comes back to Tesla, goes back to JP Morgan, these concepts from like 100 years ago, where space is not empty. Space has energy to give. In fact, it has a huge amount of energy to give. And that's what quantum mechanics tells us. And this is one of the big lies that we learn in schools, that sure, quantum mechanics exists and it shows there's this energy that's out there, but it's not enough to get anything out of it. It's called the vacuum catastrophe. Is that classical view of space-time says, well, there's only this tiny amount. So we've got this stuff going on, but we can't access it. But quantum mechanics says, no, it's like 100 orders of magnitude more energy than what you think it is. Essentially infinite, unlimited energy. We're talking the Dirac sea of energy. We're talking the ether. And the ether, I remember Terrence Howard went on Joe Rogan. He got every single physicist jumping down his throat for what he was saying. One thing he was absolutely correct about was the luminiferous ether. There is an ether that's out there. In fact, Dirac, I believe, have quoted as saying that the only way that this makes sense with quantum mechanics is that there must be a medium for an electromagnetic wave to traverse through. And people will say, well, Ashton, the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1885 said that there's no ether. That's not actually what it said. They use an interferometer. And so an interferometer is like basically taking a mirror and you bounce your laser beams and have it split, and you're looking for a shift in your interference pattern. And they didn't see any shift in the interference pattern. So they said either there must not be an ether, or the ether must be flowing with the Earth itself. Well, there's this guy named Martin Gruznik, 2009. He redid the experiment, and he had it on a spinning table. And so if you horizontally spin it, you see this interference pattern, which is just some lines basically, and it doesn't move. And you say, okay, well, that's what Michelson-Morley said. But then he flips it on its side vertically and has it spin vertically. And what happens? The interference pattern starts to shift. And the midpoint where it hits that kind of equilibrium point is perfectly parallel to the plane of the Earth. Now, what does this mean? There's another scientist whose last name is Ishmael, who reported the paper in, I think it's like the ISOR, Physics Study Review, that says that there is an ether, it's just a vertical force, not a horizontal force that we feel that's going on. And says that this can unify gravity and the blue shift that we see with respect to this. So I would argue that Martin Gruznik proved that experimentally that there is. As far as I know, no one has been able to explain the fact that he just flipped the Michelson-Morley experiment on its side and saw it differently. There were other people as well that had argued that they could prove the ether. One of them actually went on top of a mountain and ran the experiment there compared to sea level. And why is this similar? Because this is basically the equivalent of if you see a difference between at sea level and versus on a mountain, the same thing as flipping the experiment on its side, right? Because the difference is your altitude here, or your height away from the ground. And then you can start to see that there must be a connection there to gravity, because the further up you go, the less gravity you feel, right? And so now you start to see that maybe there is a unification theory where we have this ether that's out there, has unlimited energy, that is what we need for an electromagnetic wave to traverse, because all waves require a medium. And that the reason why we don't perceive this ether is because it's at the Planck scale, the smallest possible scales that are out there. Many orders of magnitude smaller than even electrons. And this has actually already been physically figured out for almost 100 years. So when I started digging into the science and finding these papers and watching these engineers who I now revere, I just started going, holy crap, this has been out there for that long. Kaluza in 1919 proposed an electromagnetic gravity unification theory. And there were some issues with it, so Klein came in and they fixed it up. So in 2026, it was approved out there. And what they did was they unified these theories through an extra dimension. Sakharov, who is a Russian physicist, 1967, 1968, he helped develop atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs for the Russians, theorized that zero-point energy is basically what the ether is made up of, could explain gravity. Hal Puthoff, he's well known in the UFO community. They've tried to discredit him. If you read his Wikipedia page, it's disgusting what they try to do to this guy. 1989, he comes out and takes Sakharov's theory and says, this is correct. I can show mathematically that zero-point energy can explain gravity, and that we can explain why there's no negative mass, and it can all be unified correctly with math all lining up exactly. The key takeaways from his paper, which everybody needs to read, Gravity is a Zero-Point Fluctuation Force, is that gravity is not a fundamental force. It's actually an induced effect from this zero-point energy field that we're always in all the time. And he says that we can shield electromagnetic waves in a Faraday cage. Like if you remember Enemy of the State, Gene Hackman's in this cage where he's blocking the electromagnetic waves so the spy agencies can't find him. That's a Faraday cage. But you can't shield gravity. And the reason why you can't shield gravity is because it's happening at that Planck scale, the zero-point energy scale that's out there. And so this paper really takes the concepts and mathematically shows that it's legit. And this was 1989 going out there. And if you read Hal Puthoff's scientific papers, I kind of went down this rabbit hole of reading this stuff. And when I got to Hal Puthoff, it was kind of the same, I call it Yahtzee moment that I had with Edward C. Lynn. You read his papers after that, and it's like, I would bet you any amount of money, this guy has seen some floaty orbs, right? Because next paper, he's working with other people talking about, well, zero-point energy also explains inertia, which essentially is like what resistance we feel when we walk around. And even if we were in outer space, we would still feel that resistance because we're constantly walking through the zero-point energy field. So another good way to think about it is like when I hold this cup, the reason why my hand doesn't go directly through the cup is because the electromagnetic force of the electrons when I hit it is repelling my fingers here. And it's all made up of fermions. So fermions have to have different points in space and time, as opposed to a boson where it can collapse down onto a single point like a laser, for example. So if we now realize that the 0-point energy field can explain gravity and it can also explain inertia, then, and we know that we can't shield the gravity, well, what happens if we shield the 0-point energy field itself? If we take that 0-point energy field and we make a bubble around it, you start to realize, well, there would be no inertia then anymore, because inertia is the 0-point energy field. And what if we remove the 0-point energy that's in front of, or the 0-point energy that's in front of me? Well, I'm going to have a pressure where I fall into that field where I make that space basically in front of me that has no 0-point energy. And for people that think, like, I used to think like, well, 0-point energy is a sci-fi concept or what have you, but it's actually experimentally proven. The number one thing that I see referenced in all of Hal Puthoff's papers is the Casimir effect. And what they did, what Hendrik Casimir did in 1948, and again, these dates are important because you're like, this is a long time ago. He just took two conductive plates and he put them very close together to one another. And what happened? They stuck together. If space is empty, why would that happen, right? If there's nothing there, that shouldn't happen. The reason why that happens is because certain wavelengths of the 0-point energy can't fit between the area between the plates. And so it creates a negative pressure differential. There's less pressure between the plates than on the outside. And that's what causes them to stick together. And so this is the part where people looked at that and they go, huh, is that negative energy? Because maybe we're looking at the issue of negative energy wrong. Maybe it's not this exotic purple substance or whatever that's out there. Maybe it's just the absence of the 0-point energy out there. What I would want people to think of is this. Classical view of physics would say, you're in an ocean that has no water in it. You're at the bottom of the bed down here. There's nothing there to give. The quantum mechanics interpretation said the lake or the ocean is completely full. And we are at the surface of it, in the equilibrium of that energy. And when you look at it like this, you go, okay, well, I can add energy to it, and I'm going to experience what we think of as gravity, like that the Earth is feeling on us now. But you could also suck away some of that energy. And if I pull that away, that's negative energy. At the end of the day, it's all just normal energy. It's just a matter of from the equilibrium level, if you're above the equilibrium or you're below the equilibrium. And so this is also what Dirac proposed. And T. Henry Moray wrote a book called The Sea of Energy. But Dirac proposed this idea of a Dirac hole, which is this idea that you can, maybe all energy comes from this 0-point field. And you can pull that energy out, and now it becomes real energy that we can interact with on a daily basis. So this is what's so revolutionary, because when you think about this, this is how I realized, oh, free energy is now possible because there's something there to give. And they've done experiments like the dynamic Casimir effect, which would say they take these rotating mirrors and they have them spin around very, very rapidly. And even conventional physics will say that these virtual particles are popping into existence all the time. What the dynamic Casimir effect does is essentially capture them. Is that in that split second where they're, into existence, they bounce off the mirrors and they become real photons, real electromagnetic energy that gets just pulled directly out of the ether. A lot of the physicists that are watching this right now are people who are skeptical, are going to say, well, I was taught that there was nothing there to give, and I was taught that this shouldn't be possible due to the laws of thermodynamics. They're going to say, you can't get free energy because energy is not created or destroyed according to the first law of thermodynamics. And we know that that's not a problem because we just take change our perspective saying there's nothing there to give to now there's this huge sea of energy that's out there. And even classical physics will say that we have these virtual particles and that we don't know what dark energy or dark matter is, but we need dark energy to explain how the universe could to expand the way it is. And physicists have historically said that dark energy must be negative based on the equations. So now you're starting to see that, okay, this sea of energy is negative energy. This can explain dark energy. And there's also this idea that I believe it came from John Archibald Wheeler, that the quantum foam. And the quantum foam is that sea of energy that's out there. The way to think of it conceptually with respect to zero point energy is imagine that space is not empty, but instead tiny bubbles that are there. And they're all touching each other all the time. And then we're moving through them like we are just fish in the fish tank out there. And once you look at it from that perspective, it becomes a lot more obvious. The second law of thermodynamics is a little bit more vague, but it's basically saying that no system can be perfectly efficient, no closed system, because you're always going to lose a little bit of energy due to heat, entropy. Well, in this type of situation, all we have to do is take Pac-Man's mouth and open up our system. The analogy that I love to use is that of a windmill. If you just put a windmill somewhere, like in this house, it's not going to do anything, right? That system itself isn't going to produce any energy. But if you open that system up to wind and you insert that wind into your system, now you can produce as much energy as you can with wind, as much wind that can be produced. This is the same concept as opening your system up to the ether, to the Dirac sea of energy that's out there. Now you have this capability. We have an unlimited reservoir of energy out there. Some people say it's like 10 to the 100 power, 100 zeros after 10 of energy that we can extract. So it's like taking a thimble and trying to empty the ocean full of the energy. It would never happen. And the moment you pull a little energy out of there, it kind of self-equalizes right away. Like, you know, the water kind of collapses onto that location and fills that location back up right away. So we can get around both the first and second laws of thermodynamics just by doing that. And the other concept that I want to throw at you real quick, and then I want to hear your thoughts, are where does energy even come from? Like, if the energy is coming from there, how does energy even really work? And I want to shout out Tom Bearden, who's one of the legends of engineers. He was lieutenant colonel, worked in black projects for decades. He put so much stuff on the internet, videos on the internet, because I think he knew like one day people are going to realize this stuff's true. And one of the big quotes he said is that all the coal and oil we've ever burned, all the wind and solar power that's out there has never added 1 watt to the electric lines, to the power lines, to the grid. And you're like, what is that? That's weird. What does that mean? And he says that all we need to have energy flow is a dipole. Imagine a battery or a capacitor. What is that? It's just an asymmetry. It means we have more negative charge on one side than on the other. And when you connect it to a circuit, it begins to flow and try to equalize. It's like trying to take the long route home. And once it all equalizes and becomes neutral, the energy stops. Our dipole closes. So he says the answer to this is keep your dipole open. As long as you have an asymmetry, a capacitor, a battery that has your more negative charge on one side than the other, energy is going to keep flowing out there. And he says what we've been doing wrong this whole time is we're destroying our dipole over and over again. We should think about the problem completely differently. What I tell people, and the analogy I give is like, if I push somebody on a swing, I don't constantly push on the swing back and forth, right? That would be silly. That's inefficient. I wait for the swing to come back, and then I push on the swing. And I push on the swing in a resonance, right? Every time it comes back. And you could, if you were to graph it on a timestamp, you could see push, 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 push. That's basically what he says that we need to do as well, is that we need to pulse a current potentially into our system. If we look at it differently, instead of pushing all the time and just push at a certain point, then potentially we can keep our dipole open much more efficiently than conventional power systems work right now. The last thing I'll say is that I don't think people even realize how power plants work, like a nuclear power plant. I think a lot of people have this idea of like, oh, we're splitting an atom and then the electricity comes out of the atom and we're extracting that. And that would seem efficient if that was the case. That's not what we do at all. We basically put some material into a water, it boils the water, the steam comes out of the water, and then it spins a turbine. And that turbine is basically a generator, or it's like I could just hand crank a generator. And that generator creates the asymmetry of the charges, creates our dipole there. And this is what I think Tesla figured out. I think he figured it out over 100 years ago. I think many other people have figured it out. I think a lot of these over unity free energy devices that people have discredited really do work.
Do you owe back taxes? Pandemic relief is now over. The IRS is hiring thousands of new agents and field officers and has kicked off 2024 by sending over 5 million pay-up letters to those who have unfiled tax returns or balances owed. Don't waive your rights and speak with them on your own. They are not your friends. Tax Network USA, a trusted tax relief firm, has saved over $1 billion in back taxes for their clients. They can help you secure the best deal possible. Whether you owe $10,000 or $10 million, they can help you. Whether it's business or personal taxes, even if you have the means to pay or are on a fixed income, they can help finally resolve your tax burdens. Call 1-800-985-1000 for a private free consultation or visit tnusa.com/Candace. That's tnusa.com/Candace.
A lot of these people ended up dead or in prison too.
Yes.
Once you start looking into anything that would have moved humanity forward, they're all called quacks. They're imprisoned for fraud, which is a very strange thing to do in a free market, to imprison someone for fraud. And it gets very interesting very quick when you once you know what you're looking for and you realize that there has been some sort of a government conspiracy to keep information from us. In fact, one of the things that I say is when you really start getting into history, you realize that enlightenment they tell you about was actually the dawn of humanity being darkened. Like it's actually we are in the dark ages, I think, right now. And when somebody pops their head up and starts to look and says, hey, we could just be doing this,
And that's what's scary, because
it comes down on them. The whole system comes down on them.
absolutely, and who is the system? That's a big question I ask too, because I think it's more than just the government. I actually like the term deep state, but I don't think we should be thinking on it in terms of just the CIA. Certainly the CIA is part of it, I think, no doubt whatsoever. I think they know basically everything's out there, but the large corporations, right? I think that the two...
Well, I think they are the CIA. That's my point.
Oh,
When I say, like, all these stories of like, I was just in my garage and I made Google. And I'm like, I don't think that's exactly how it happened, actually. I don't think
Actually,
you
the CIA
are.
helped fund Google Earth, which is kind of interesting. The CIA also fund Palantir, which Peter Thiel is the head of. I mean, you look at this and you see that really what we're dealing with is very connected people that are very rich, that are connected. I mean, honestly, even Elon Musk, who refuses to comment about these videos, he's one of the biggest defense contractors for the US government through SpaceX. He actually just sent up more spy satellites. They're putting a new constellation up, actually, of satellites that are smaller and many more of them, because they're afraid that Russia and China are going to use electromagnetic-based weapons to wipe out our satellites, and then our constellation is screwed. So they're now like basically diversifying their risk by putting more out there, which is why I think these guys can't talk about a lot of the surveillance stuff, because he's got NDAs that like if those videos are real and that's a satellite video, his NDA says he can't speak about it, right? Which makes me, look, I understand it from these kind of perspective, from Elon Musk perspective, the Lou Elizondos, these other UFO people, is that free energy is dangerous, because if you do have this capability to just pull energy straight out of the ether that's out there, you can just accumulate that energy. Or what if we can amplify how much we pull out of there? Maybe plasma, like a plasma orb, can basically just use the same resonance. Like if I was in my bathtub and I'm taking a bath and I start rocking back and forth, at a resonance, eventually the water is going to start shooting over the side of the tub, right? It starts to amplify more and more and more and more and more through like standing waves, potentially. So if you can do that with energy as well, potentially using that same Casimir effect, but we don't need to use two plates. We can engineer it a little bit differently. What if there's other ways where we can find an asymmetry? And if we can do that, it becomes dangerous. This is where I spoke to Salvatore Paez. Big shout out to him. Everybody should take a look at his patents, because he's got high frequency gravitational wave generator. He's got inertial mass reduction for a transmedium craft as one of his patents. He's also got plasma confinement based on magnets as well. And there are like a bunch of experiments that you can see on the internet, but the guy who should really get a lot of shout out is a guy named Ken Shoulders. Ken Shoulders, actually Richard Feynman was the person who said that there's enough energy like in this cup, just in the area of this cup, in the 0 point energy, to vaporize all the Earth's oceans. So he was one of those people who was saying, there's not nothing here, there's this huge amount. Ken Shoulders was researching plasmas. He called them exotic vacuum objects because he believed that they were extracting energy from the vacuum. And Richard Feynman initially thought he was kind of kooky, that he didn't have it figured out. He ended up having to apologize to him, because he was like, no, but you're right, we can do this. Well, Hal Puthoff wrote a paper with coal where they showed that Casimir effect does not violate laws of thermodynamics. And one thing he said there is, A better mechanism for the Casimir effect might be a highly charged plasma. Now, when you look into Ken Shoulders' work of exotic vacuum objects, you find out that one of the things that happens in these plasmas, which is the fourth state of matter, is the electrons start to break free. Not only do they break free, but they start to act weird. Normally, like I said before, the electrons will basically repel one another because they have the same charge. So they will potentially, the closer you get, the more they're going to repel one another. But when they start to break free and in superconductivity, they form Cooper pairs, we call them, which is basically the electrons start to group up when they really shouldn't. Now, why is this important? Because remember what I just said about the dipole and the capacitor. If you have this asymmetry where your electrons are grouped up, and now you have this asymmetry where there's more down here than there is up here, you're going to get energy flowing. So Ken Shoulders found out and proposed that you could have basically a self-sustaining ball of plasma that is constantly pulling energy directly out of the ether. And the dynamic Casimir effect, along with the Schwinger effect and the Schwinger limit, would propose that when we do this, when we pull these photons out of the ether, it may create a magnetic monopole. Now, a magnetic monopole, if you look at a magnet, it's going to have these magnetic field lines that go from north to south. A magnetic monopole is just a north or just a south, meaning it's just pulling inward or just pushing outward. And this can be used to very accurately control a magnetic field. So now when we look at that thermal video of the orbs that we were looking at MH370, based on what I've said to you right now, it's like, well, wow, we can almost explain everything that we're seeing here now. We can say that this is a field of plasma, this ball. It's a non-radiating barrier, the edge of it, is basically where the magnetic field stops, so to speak. You can even see a heat signature that's shaped like the Tesla sign in there, which could be like a vortex, which is where, think of it like your drain when you pull the water out of your tub and you see the drain. Same concept, but between what we perceive all around us and this ether that's going on there. And then with respect to these dark lines we see in front of the orbs, that's basically just negative energy. They're basically shielding the 0 point energy in front of the orb, which allows it to just float freely. Similar to if I was on one of those conveyor belt things, right? It's not that me that's moving, it's space itself that's moving. So they're essentially an Alcubierre warp drive, I would argue. And warp drive doesn't have to be superluminal speeds beyond the speed of light. It can also be any speed that you technically want it to go. And then what's happening when the plane disappears? Well, now these same orbs converge on the plane. And now that we've shown that there's this 0 point energy connection to gravity, we can see that what if we look at the Coulomb's law, which is an electric force law. If you imagine those orbs are magnets and they have each has the same charge. If I were to jam two magnets together, I'm going to feel a strong repulsive force. Potentially that's what the orbs are doing when they're converging, because they're in a perfect equilateral triangle. So at the midpoint there, you're going to have your 0 point, as they call it, where everything's going to converge directly on the plane. So that would be the exact center of the singularity that you're forming. And potentially they're producing a magnetic flux that's so powerful by jamming them together at a certain speed that it breaks space-time, so to speak, just makes a ripple, so to speak, as you were saying in terms of surfing. And now that plane moves faster than the speed of light. And it doesn't move faster than the speed of light itself, but from outside perspective, looking at it, it's looking like it's moving faster than the speed of light. It just disappears here and then shows up over here somewhere else. And it's not the plane that's moving, but the medium that's moving from one location to the other. And it looks weird to us because we don't perceive that extra dimension that's already out there.
Interesting. So then if they're able to do this, which I think they are, and they sort of use this technology to move the plane, what do you think happened to the passengers? What do you think happened to the cargo? And what do you think happened as well? Do you think that's the reason, rather, that the debris was found where it was?
Yeah, so I would argue it could even be the fire, or it could be the event that caused some structural integrity to the plane, for sure. I think that if you use the right-hand rule in electrical engineering, which takes your electric and your magnetic fields, and you create something called the Poynting vector, which would determine the flow of power, the vector of your wave, you can see these orbs actually change their orientation. They're in this triangle formation spinning around the plane, but then they go vertical. completely vertical. And you're like, huh, that's interesting. And it starts spinning. If you were looking directly at the plane, they would be going clockwise. And if you use that as your magnetic vector and your curl of my hands here, you'll find that the pointing vector would be backwards. Now, this is really interesting because if you take the frame right before, as the orbs are converging, and the frame as this dark, cold endothermic event happens, which is potentially consistent with a negative energy type event happening, it looks like the plane goes backwards a little bit. You can kind of see the tail sticking out of this endothermic event that begins to form. And if it's going backwards, we've mapped the direction of travel of the plane based on the satellite coordinates going east. So that means it must be going somewhere to the west. Well, this is interesting because that fire suppression bottle was found in the Maldives over to the west. There was actually 20 more witnesses, 15 to 20 more witnesses on a small island in the Maldives in the early morning hours that saw the plane. And they were also all discredited because they said, well, there's no way. They saw the plane coming from the west. And people thought, well, even if this was the plane, it had to be coming from the east because that's where Nicobar Islands is, or in the South Indian Ocean. But if this plane is just snapping from one location to the other, now they might have actually seen the plane. These are people on a small island of like 3,000 people. They don't see jumbo jets flying low over their thing. They even saw the red and white stripe of Malaysian Airlines.
Wow.
Sergio Coloduvo, I think his name is, went out there and interviewed them. I watched the interviews. These guys they're not lying. They're not making up this story.
For what
And
reason?
where did they see the plane go? South, towards Diego Garcia military base.
Fascinating.
The argument, this is the base that all the conspiracy theories basically said this plane got remote controlled there or what have you. Marc Dugain, who's a famous French author, actually was told to stop looking into the plane, and he had speculated the plane ended up there as well, like months after this thing disappeared. Catherine T., that witness that we said, I think it was in her 2018 blog, said that she thought the plane ended up at Diego Garcia. It's the only place to hide a plane. And then when you look at that debris drift analysis again, you realize a much better location for that debris to have gotten in the water is Diego Garcia. It actually fits with the currents, and it would make sense in terms of when that debris showed up in Africa as well. And I look at that and I go, we actually looked at the debris analysis that they did, and like at least 5 different pieces say it looked like the pieces were pulled apart. And I'm going, that doesn't sound like structural integrity. It sounds like they just disassembled the plane and threw a couple pieces in the ocean, right? And nobody questions, like, why does this debris show up in Africa? CNN, man, first of all, Don Lemon, shout out to Don Lemon. He might have been the most accurate. It's not technically a black hole, but wormhole is pretty close to a black hole. The only difference is there's no event horizon, which means that for the people that went through it, it would look like they're just walking through a doorway. Yeah. Like you instantly appear on the other side. But from the observer's perspective, there might even be a time dilation effect where they show up like a few minutes later, a few seconds later, a few hours later. It's really hard to tell. But CNN also ran this other piece where like they angrily mentioned like there's this conspiracy theory out there that the plane went to Diego Garcia. There's no merit to it whatsoever, but they don't actually address any of the arguments either.
What if it was hijacking or terrorism or mechanical failure or pilot error? But what if it was something fully that we don't really understand? A lot of people have been asking about that, about black holes and on and on and on and all of these conspiracy theories. Let's look at this. Noah says, what else can you think about? Black hole, Bermuda Triangle. And then Deji says, just like the movie Lost. And of course, they're also referencing the Twilight Zone, which has a very similar plot. That's what people are saying. I know it's preposterous, but is it preposterous, you think, Mary?
Well, it is. A black hole is about, a small black hole would suck in our entire universe, so we know it's not that. Bermuda Triangle is often weather, and Lost is a TV show. So right. I think I always like things for which there's data, history, crunch the numbers. So for me, those aren't there, but I think it's wonderful that the whole world is trying to help with their theories, and I absolutely love the theories.
I always say,
classic, right?
Yeah, we always know you're onto it because they're angry about something that shouldn't make them angry.
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
authoritarian, it's not rational, and it's just, you're really stupid if you think this, and that should be a starting point. Look, we have covered so much here. This is absolutely fascinating, and I want to encourage everybody that's watching this to follow you. Where can they follow you and continue to look into this story if they want to know more?
Yeah, so the best place to follow me is on Twitter, on X. I feel like if I was anywhere else, I would have probably already been banned. and wiped out. I'm actually surprised my YouTube channel hasn't been deleted, but that's mostly because I think I focus on the science now at this point. So you guys can watch my live streams Monday, Wednesday, Friday, talk about the plane, talk about secret science that's being held from us, talk about free energy on Fridays as well. And then on X, it's at JustXAshton, also at JustXAshton on YouTube as well. I am going to start posting clips from a lot of the appearances I've done. I've done like over 100 podcast appearances on TikTok and Instagram. Not that I love it, but if you want to interact with me, you come onto Twitter for sure. Yeah.
Ashton, thank you so much for joining us. This has honestly been one of my favorite conversations that I've ever had.
Thank you, Candace. I appreciate it. You're awesome.